This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I am Gilad Halpern.
And I am Dalia Shenlin. I am your co-host together with Gilad, and we'll be talking every week about books and ideas and things that have caught our attention. Our guest today is a senior lecturer in Japanology at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Just under 2 years ago, Dr. Meron Medzini was here to discuss his biography of Golda Meir, and he's back here today to discuss his latest book entitled Under the Shadow of the Rising Sun, Japan and the Jews During the Holocaust Era, the English translation of which has just been published by Academic Studies Press. Dr. Meron Medzini, hello and welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here.
Welcome back, we should say. Let's start with a general question, because the Jewish question was predominantly a European and Middle Eastern question where Jews were present for centuries, if not millennia, and also played a significant role in their respective societies. This was not the case in Japan. So when we're talking about Japan in the late 19th, early 20th century, can we talk about a Jewish question, big or small?
Not at all, not big and not small, because Japan is a classic case of a country that there was anti-Semitism without Jews. The Jews were part of the foreign community, gaijin, they were foreigners, and they played absolutely no role in media, in academia, in science, in medicine. They were business people. Most of them didn't speak the language, and therefore they had no impact on whatever was happening in Japan. And most Japanese never met a Jew in their lives.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain to us, back up, how did they even get there? I understand there was an influx of Jewish migration to Japan, probably not huge numbers, but in the mid-19th century. What were they doing there?
Not an influx. We're talking about scores of people.
Scores.
Some came from the States after Japan was opened by the United States. Some came
forcibly, right?
Not forcibly, under threat.
Mm-hmm.
Japanese realized that they couldn't face an American threat, and therefore they decided to cave in and sign a treaty with America. We're talking about 1854. And a few Jews began to arrive thereafter, settling in Yokohama, and mainly in Nagasaki, and later on in Kobe. They didn't settle in Tokyo. These people were predominantly business people, and eventually some of them began to arrive from Russia, Tsarist Russia, and after the 1917 revolution, Communist Russia. A very few German Jews came in the 30s. Mm-hmm. I would say that in the 20s and 30s, the Jewish community of Japan never exceeded 1,000 people.
Yeah, but they were also part of another newly arrived community, which was Westerners in general, because up until then, Japan had been completely closed to the outside world. So my question is, did the Japanese could they even distinguish between the Jews and the non-Jews?
Were they all just forms of gaijin?
No, most of them were gaijin, but they did distinguish because Jews prayed on Saturday instead of Sunday. The Jews put mezuzah on their doors. The Jews ate kosher food, some of them, and the Jews asked for special burial sites. Mm-hmm. So they realized that it was something different.
Yeah, but the attitude to the Jews, was it different from the attitude towards Christians?
Similar to attitude towards Christian. Actually, towards the end of the 19th century, all sorts of ideas began to be floated around in Japan. For example, that the Japanese are actually descendants of the 10 lost tribes. And people were looking for connections, and in fact, some of them still do.
So this gets into the very interesting sort of dual or competing approaches to the Jews. On one level, a sort of strange fascination, maybe even admiration, but also some forms of maybe inherited or imported classic European anti-Semitism.
I would say love-hate relations, to put it more precisely. After the Russo-Japanese War, Japan sought enormous financial assistance, and it was given to them by an American Jewish banker, Yaakov Schiff, who was totally opposed to the Russian attitude towards Jews, pogroms of 1904.
So pre-communist Russia.
We're talking about pre-communist Russia. And he put together a consortium, mostly of Jewish bankers, Loon, Kobe, Warburg, Lehman, Kassel, and himself. And they were able to produce for Japan huge amount of money, really kept them going. And therefore they realized for the first time that Jews are very influential in banking and finance. Later on they realized that Jews in America have enormous influence on media and politics and diplomacy. So here is the fascination. Don't argue, don't quarrel with the Jews.
So, and the same thing, the same feeling, the same attitude emerged after the communist revolution in Russia. They perceived the Russian Jews as extremely influential in Moscow.
But there you had a problem. This is the beginning of the fear of the Jews. On the one hand, they realized that the majority of Soviet leadership was Jewish. On the other hand, they also realized that the Soviet Jewish leadership was responsible for killing the Tsar, regicide, which is something that they were terrified. And then they came to realize that Marxism, Karl Marx, and later on others, Trotsky, there were all sorts of rumors that Lenin had some Jewish blood. In other words, Jews were extremely influential. And this attitude was created also, or was strengthened also by the White Russians, who ran away as a result of the communist takeover, most of them from Siberia. And they ended up either in Manchuria or a few of them in Japan. Japan had an expeditionary force in Siberia between 1918 and 1922. About 70,000 Japanese soldiers there as part of an international intervention. And
to try to curb the Soviet expansion.
Curb Soviet expansion. Initially, the argument, the excuse was to help the Czech Legion leave Russia and travel to Europe in order to participate in the closing phases of World War I. The White Russians, for the first time, showed some Japanese officers a document called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And that attracted some interest.
And this was around the same time they were starting to understand that the communists had partly been, that Jews had been heavily involved in the communist takeover.
Absolutely.
And understanding their role in American finance and media.
Right.
So they're sort of putting all the pieces together contemporaneously.
Some Japanese. The Japanese anti-Semitism never seeped to the street. It was never street anti-Semitism.
Because as you said, there were so few of them, it's not like most people actually knew them.
They
were
didn't
just
know them.
maybe a rumor mill.
The influence of the White Russians, especially in Manchuria, was quite impressive. And they were the ones who taught the Japanese officers, including two specialists on so-called Jewish affairs, that the Jews are to be feared, that the Jews are to be suspected. They could never be trusted, could never be relied upon. And in 1922, the protocols were translated into Japanese. Therefore, the Japanese anti-Semitism was limited to very few people, especially in the army. Later on, some people in the foreign ministry, predominantly those who served in Europe in one way or another. I'll give you one example. One of the leading anti-Semites in Japan in the 30s and during the war, General Shodan Nobutaka. He served as the military attaché of Japan in France during World War I. And later on, he was in Germany. And from there, he picked up the German anti-Semitism, later on the Nazi anti-Semitism. But this was rare because on the other side, there was the realization that A, the Jews are not a threat, B, there are so few of them, C, it would be very useful to get along with them. And I'll give you one example. When Japan took over Manchuria, 1931, there were about 15,000 Jews, mostly in Harbin. And Japan, some Japanese officials, both in Manchuria and in Tokyo, asked themselves, how do we create a situation whereby German Jews, who were beginning to leave Germany as a result of Hitler coming to power, maybe we could tempt or lure them to come to Manchuria and invest and produce their skills and their knowledge in running businesses and so on. This eventually became known as the Fugo Plan. But these were only vague thoughts. It was never a...
And also believing the Jews had this enormous influence both in Washington and in Moscow. Did they ever think of leveraging this Jewish influence into getting the world powers to recognize Japan's imperial ambitions in Asia, predominantly in Manchuria?
To a tiny degree in 38, 39. They created a Jewish Congress of Far Eastern Jewish communities, and they had 3 congresses in Harbin. The first one, I think, was 37, was addressed by a Japanese general. And the idea of the Japanese government, which sponsored the whole thing, was why don't you get in touch with American Jewish leaders and try to influence them? And through them to influence the Roosevelt administration. This failed miserably. Absolutely miserable.
Because the powers were absolutely unanimous in not recognizing Japan's
because Japan by then was the image of Japan as a result of the atrocities they committed mainly in Nanjing at the end of 1937 was such that it would never have worked.
So in a way, this is emblematic of this dual relationship that Japan has with the Jews, because on the one hand, they have this strange, these racist stereotypes, and on the other hand, they have a sort of protected situation relative to what's going on in Europe, despite all the atrocities that are going on in the time of Japan's invasion of China. How do you explain this?
Japanese officials, and we talk about officials, we're not talking about the street. This is never the situation, unlike Europe. What they tried to do, essentially, was to see if they could mobilize Jewish capital and some Jewish knowledge. But I can't say that really there was any real thought given to it. I've never seen any operational plans, that sort of thing.
Let me ask you something about the nature of this understanding of Jews. It sounds like on a deeper level they sort of imported, Russian and traditional European understandings of anti-Semitism, but that it never totally took root because of that lack of presence and history throughout the centuries. Do you think that this was responsible for the sort of more calculated, pragmatic, cost-benefit attitudes towards Jews rather than emotional racism?
In other words, the Jewish question was instrumentalized by the Japanese.
Just an instrumental.
Yeah, there was really very little Jewish question. I think in the archives in Tokyo Foreign Ministry there were 10 files, what they call Judea Mondai, the Jewish question. Mm-hmm. Part of their anti-Semitism was anti-foreignism. I'll give you an example.
So not unique to Jews in that sense.
I was in Tokyo once. It was the Clinton administration in the early 90s. And there was an American delegation who came, Secretary of Treasury Rubin, Commissioner of Trade, I think her name was Rivlin, and there was somebody else called Cantor. And a friend of mine, Japanese professor, said to me, don't they have others? Which means that the whole thing is Jewish. Mm-hmm. And you had in the 80s a resurgence of some publications in Japan against Jews. And the major thrust was to hit America. But you don't want to hit America, because America is the protector of Japan. And therefore, the Jews are an easier target.
Sort of a proxy.
Yeah, but there was some of it in the 80s no longer exists. Mm-hmm. The problem of Israel with Japan had nothing to do with Jewish community there. It had to do with Arab oil.
Sure.
You have these fascinating characters in the book that seem sort of dramatic, like part of a great historic drama, almost like figures in a novel. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about two of the main ones. Let me see if I'm going to say this right. Norihiro Yasue and Captain Koreshiga Inuzuka.
These were the two so-called Jewish experts. Where did they learn something about Jews? In Manchuria. And they were officers in the special branch. And this is where they met mostly white Russians. But they were told by headquarters in Tokyo, it would be a good idea if we have some Jewish experts, what it's all about.
And we're going back to the 1930s
We're
now,
going
right?
back to 20s.
20s.
To the 20s. And in fact, one of them, I think Yasue, was sent here. Came to Palestine in 1927 to see what the Zionists were up to in Palestine. He came with somebody else called Shogun. And the Jewish agency asked my late father to accompany them. And he was with them for about 5 days, showing them the sites, kibbutzim, moshavim, Hebrew University, Kiryat Anavim. He met with Colonel Kish, who was the senior Zionist official at the time. And apparently they were quite impressed. Why did they choose my father? Because he spoke English, he spoke Russian, didn't speak Japanese. So with one of them he spoke in English, the other he spoke in Russian, and they translated to each other. And eventually Yasuo wrote some interesting articles. He eventually ended up in Manchuria as a specialist. He ended up in Shanghai as chief advisor. Interestingly enough, one of them, I forget if it was the Navy guy, the captain or the other, received a box from the United States. He was for helping Jewish refugees get somehow to Japan.
Did he get any word of the thing of the concept of Zionism? Did they understand what it was?
They did. They did understand. In fact, Japan issued a proclamation of support for the Balfour Declaration almost 100 years ago. Two such declarations. And I asked myself, why did they do it? Partly because the British said to them, it's a good thing. And they were then allied with the British. And they felt if the British say it's good, who are we to say no? Secondly, they knew virtually nothing about the Middle East. Thirdly, they thought this would be a sort of quid pro quo. We'll help the British get the mandate over Palestine. They will help us remain in some parts of China or get the mandate over certain islands in the Pacific.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe you can explain more about Japan's formal reaction to the Nazis during the war and their policy towards Jews, because that's an interesting story that comes out of it.
The story is very simple. They knew nothing about the Holocaust.
But they did know about racial policies.
They knew about racial policies. They had certain accounts to settle with Hitler. Because in Mein Kampf, he divides the world into three parts. Creators, initiators of culture, that's the Aryans. Transmitters of culture, Japanese and Chinese and others. And destroyers of culture, that's the Jews. In other words, they were never seen as category one. They were seen by Hitler as inferior.
And that didn't sit well with them.
And no, they didn't like it to such an extent that those parts dealing with Asia in Mein Kampf were not translated. Or were translated but not printed in Japan. They did the Rosenberg works on anti-Semitism were translated. Those who knew something about these racial policies were predominantly Japanese officers who served in Germany and diplomats. And they decided already as early as 1938, we will have nothing to do with these racial policies. We will treat the Jews as we treat other foreigners.
Was it an informed decision?
There was a 1938 decision made by the highest decision makers in Japan, the Prime Minister, Foreign Minister, Army, Navy, and Finance. And this was repeated in early 1942, when Japan was at the height of its occupation in Southeast Asia. Same thing. But we have to watch the Jews.
And that plan to lure German Jews to come to Manchuria, whatever happened to it?
It was considered, it was discussed, it never matured to any official plan. It was never discussed at the highest level of government. I've never seen an operational plan. It was an idea.
And what would the plan have entailed? Maybe just explain a little bit.
It would have entailed allowing 50,000 German Jews running away from Hitler to settle in Manchuria, not in Japan proper, in Manchuria. Hopefully bring their capital with them, and above all bring their skills. And they would invest in Japan, and they would develop Japanese industries and other companies in Manchuria.
It was pretty similar to the agreement that the Nazi Germany had with the Zionist organization, the Havara agreement.
No, that's a totally different story, because our agreement with the Germans in 33, 34, in which, by the way, a future prime minister was involved, Levi Eshkol, he was sent to Germany. No, the idea was Jews were immigrating to Israel. Jews were not immigrating to Japan, and Jews were not immigrating. It was seen as a temporary situation. This is why it never took roots.
But it is still interesting that they were considering this plan to bring Jews when they were brutalizing the local population. In other words, treating the Jews as worthy somehow.
No, they were brutalizing the Chinese in Nanjing about 4 or 5 years later, at the end of 37.
Yes, but was the occupation at that time peaceful? I mean,
in Manchuria, yes.
Okay.
There was no resistance.
I stand corrected.
No, there was no resistance to Japanese takeover in Manchuria. And they were not yet brutalizing. The brutality was in
37.
Nanjing and after that.
I want you to talk about now another interesting character. Let me see if I can pronounce his name right. Chiyune Sugihara.
Oh, he is extremely interesting.
Yeah, he was recognized as righteous among the nations. He was a consul, Japanese consul in Lithuania, right? Who saved thousands of Jews. He was the Japanese Raoul Wallenberg, wasn't he?
There are still serious doubts about that. He was a Sovietologist, where these two chaps, the captain and the colonel, studied Russian. He also studied Russian. And he was what we used to call Sovietologist. And as such, he worked in Manchuria, and then he worked in Japan. And then he was supposed to go to Moscow to be part of the Japanese embassy. The Russians said no, because we know who he is. As a result of that, he was sent to Europe and ended up in Kaunas in late 1939. His brief was basically, you are to report to Tokyo on Germans' intentions regarding Russia. Are the Germans going to attack Russia? And he said basically at some point, yes. And you are supposed to report to us on what the Russians are doing, because Lithuania at the time was under Russian occupation as a result of the Molotov-Ribbentrop agreement.
Yep.
He befriended some Jews. He knew about Jews already in Manchuria. His first wife was a white Russian. She probably was anti-Semitic. But then he divorced her, married a Japanese woman. There were reports that he attended a Hanukkah candle lighting at the home of some wealthy Jews in Kaunas. Eventually, he came to the conclusion that in order to be better, more effective in what he was supposed to do, he should be in touch with Polish resistance, Polish underground. Poland by then was occupied. And he should also seek information from Jews, because quite a few Jews came from Poland. Among them, for example, was Menachem Begin. And there were a few others. And at some point, Jews discovered that they wanted to get out. Nobody would take them. And in fact, the Japanese asked a number of foreign diplomats in Tokyo, if you are so concerned about the Jews, why don't you let them in? And at the time, nobody let the Jews in. Chaim Weizmann once said, the world is divided into two parts, those who want to kick the Jews out and those who don't want to let them in. a number of Jews came and said to him, we would like visas. And he asked Tokyo, and Tokyo said no. But if they're on their way to somewhere else and they've got visas to prove, then we prepare to give them transit visas for about 3 weeks. Turned out some Jews discovered that you could get a visa on a separate piece of paper to a place called Curaçao, which is a Dutch island in the Caribbean, offshore Venezuela. And the Dutch ambassador and Dutch consul were prepared to issue these things. And therefore they came to him and said, we are going to Curaçao, a place that nobody ever heard of. And we would like transit visas. And this he said, okay. He issued 2,160 visas, but some of them were family visas. As a result, people affected were probably about 6,000. Now, bear in mind, there was no Holocaust yet. We're talking about August 1940. And Jews were not yet under this massive threat as they were since early 1942. But still, he felt compassion. And he produced these visas. It's still a big argument whether Tokyo said no and he defied them or Tokyo said yes. Tokyo said make sure that they have funds to keep them going in Japan. The funds were provided by American Jews.
So basically they paid off their...
They paid off, and then problem arose, how do they get to Japan? So the only way was through Russia, the Siberian Railway, who paid the joint American Jews. And therefore the Russians were quite interested. I think they charged $250 per person, which is a huge amount of money at the time. Now, he was given Rajus Gentile much later. It's in the early 80s. Because that suited both Israel and Japan. Through Sugihara, Israel wanted to teach Japanese the Holocaust. Why are we giving him? Because he saved Jews. And why did he have to save Jews? Because of Holocaust. The Japanese wanted to have one of them at least look nice and be recognized. He was here, by the way, in 69. 68 or 69. He was brought here by Wahrhaftig, who was a minister in the government, who was given a visa by Sugihara. And Hebrew University gave his son a scholarship. And the process of recognizing him as Rajus Gentile started.
So basically the thing is that the Holocaust was never, the legacy of the Holocaust or the memory of the Holocaust never really took hold in Japan because they had their own catastrophe from the Second World War to deal with.
They said, Holocaust, come to us, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There was another reason for their lack of knowledge. The United States never didn't go out of its way to tell the Japanese what the Germans have done to the Jews, for a very simple reason. The Japanese would have then asked them, why didn't you open up your gates? Why didn't you let the Jews in? And there was no valid answer to that. And therefore, the first time more and more Japanese realized that there was Holocaust was 1955.
What happened then?
The publication of the Diary of Anna Frank, which made enormous impact. The next one was the Eichmann trial. And the Eichmann trial already attracted a number of Japanese journalists who came here. And they started reporting. And since then, there is much, enormous knowledge in Japan about Holocaust. There is, in fact, a Holocaust museum near Hiroshima.
You know, what's interesting is that ultimately no nation comes out of the Holocaust looking very good. But it's what I did read in one of the reviews about your book is that 170 different anti-Semitic books were published in Japan between 1936 up to 1945. Why did this not turn Japan into a massively anti-Semitic country?
Because very
it just
few
didn't seem to take hold.
Because very few people read it.
Okay.
And it never had the sanction of the emperor or the government. The Jewish question was discussed in the Japanese parliament, I think, twice or three times. That's it.
Was it significant within the army?
No.
Not even in the army.
The attitude of army commanders towards Jews was very much, it depended very much on who was camp commander. Those camp commanders who served at some point in Manchuria were a bit more hostile.
Right.
But the average Japanese camp commander...
It just doesn't seem to come naturally or deeply embedded in the culture to hate Jews. That is Dr. Meron Medzini talking about Under the Shadow of the Rising Sun, Japan and the Jews during the Holocaust era, which has just been published in English by Academic Studies Press. We also want to point out that your biography of Golda Meir from 2008 is about to appear in English, translated into English. That's a long biography. It'll appear next month, and you won the Prime Minister's Prize for that in 2010, so that is definitely worth the read.
And listen to the Tel Aviv Review item with Professor Medzini about his biography of Golda.
Always. Dr. Medzini, thank you so much for being with us.
Pleasure.
And also big thanks to Tammy Goldenberg, our sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute for the generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick. Also, don't forget to visit our new website, telavivreview.org. Like us on Facebook and follow me and Dalia on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.